Over the past few months, my 3-year-old son has started to get interested in those children's illustrated Bibles, which as a person of faith makes my heart all happy to pass on my love of Scripture to my child. But honestly, it's been a lot more challenging than I anticipated. Our nightly ritual goes a little something like this. Child opens Bible, asks why no fire trucks were there to help Moses with the burning bush, turns page. Why is Abel lying on the ground? Why isn't he moving? Turns page again. Why are those men putting Joseph in that big hole? Another page. Why is Abraham standing over that boy, hand raised? And that's about the time that I frantically flip forward and try to find some picture of a sheep or something. This whole thing is a daily reminder that if we did not open up this book already believing that what we are about to read is in fact good news, there's much that would prevent us from reaching that conclusion on our own. Despite the cheerful animals painted marching 2 by 2, much of the Bible is not a children's story, but rather a tale of broken people seeking and being sought by a God who somehow works through and in spite of their brokenness, a God who makes a way out of no way. We know that we are living through extraordinary and extraordinarily complicated days, a global pandemic, people taking to the streets all over the world, profound divisions across race and political parties, a general sense of distrust and authority. In so many ways, we are a people in the wilderness, trying to figure out what our next step might be. And we live in a culture that's deeply uncomfortable with the complexities of wilderness, of not knowing. And some of how we deal with that discomfort is to make complicated things really, really simple. I'm Team A or Team B. I support cops. I support racial justice. I support business. I support health. But where I think people of faith are so very, very fortunate is that we have access in our lifeblood to these incredibly complicated stories as part of our history. We are well-resourced when it comes to seeking truth and grace within even the most convoluted of circumstances. We know that beauty can come out of broken places. In the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, blessing and brokenness are so tightly interwound that it's hard to know where one ends and the other begins. Abraham and Sarah are the ancestors of the people of God, and the ones from whom Jews, Christians, and Muslims all claim our heritage. And their lives together form part of a larger narrative. And for our purposes, I think it's helpful to give a very quick overview of what the major points of that is. So Abraham and Sarah married, and Abraham gets a call from God to move to a new land. There's a famine in that land where he's been called, so Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt, and Abraham is worried there for his own safety. So he gives Sarah as a slave to the Pharaoh. And one wonders what she thought of this plan. It was certainly not a good one for her. Pharaoh eventually figures out that Sarah is Abraham's wife because God sends sort of a bunch of plagues, and Pharaoh kicks both of them out of Egypt. And after all of this, God makes Abraham a promise that he would have descendants. But Sarah couldn't have kids, so she did what was legal at the time, which was to give her slave Hagar to Abraham so that he might have a child through her. And obviously this is done without Hagar, who's an Egyptian slave's input or consent. So Hagar does become pregnant. And Sarah at that point starts thinking maybe this actually wasn't the best plan because Hagar, pregnant, is getting a little full of herself, and she doesn't really remember her place. So Sarah beats her so badly that Hagar runs into the wilderness to escape. An angel of the Lord meets Hagar in the desert and tells her to go back to Sarah and to submit to her, which is where some of us reading the story sort of screech to a halt and say, wait, what? This God who of justice and mercy, the God who liberates, is sending this desperate, fleeing, pregnant woman back into slavery. And that could be the subject of an entirely different sermon, but I'm just going to leave it there for today. In any case, Hagar does go back to Abraham and Sarah, and she has a boy that she names Ishmael, which means God hears. So fast forward a little bit, Sarah, now in old age, is promised a baby by God. She becomes pregnant and delivers Isaac, which could have been a wonderful beginning to the next chapter of the story. Except Sarah decides that Ishmael, the son of a slave, is getting a little too comfortable. She convinces Abraham to throw both him and Hagar out, with the assumption or hope that they die out in the desert and leave her own child's position unchallenged. Now, if this story was being told not as ancient sacred literature, but as a contemporary rendition of events, we would note a number of troubling aspects. Among them, domestic violence, poverty, homelessness, infertility, single parenting, human trafficking, and a victim, Sarah, who goes on to become the perpetrator of abuse. And lest you think that we are just sort of being overly sensitive with our modern sensibilities, it's important to know that this relationship between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar has been disturbing readers for millennia. As long as there have been people writing about the Bible way back to New Testament times, even where people had this, slavery was very common, even then people have been trying to make sense of why these two women, who could have been so deeply united in their shared struggles and their experiences, were enemies. It's hard to hold up both Sarah and Abraham as these revered parents of faith, and at the same time state the obvious, that they were willing to violate the principles of justice, to do terrible, even evil things to vulnerable people. And so we wonder, were they good people in a bad system? Were they hurt people, hurting people? Do rules of basic human morality not apply to people in these unique positions with God? And for a long time, the way the church, or really the white church, has dealt with this conundrum is to make Hagar an afterthought. Many of us probably grew up with a dozen little Sarahs among our classmates, but we couldn't ever recall meeting a Hagar. Small children in Sunday school tell us about how Sarah laughed at the news that she would bear a son in her old age, but they talk a lot less about the fear that led Sarah to sacrifice his brother. But this is less so for the African American church, and particularly African American women who have a rich tradition around Aunt Hagar. Aunt Hagar was the first runaway slave, the first woman to receive an annunciation, the first person in the Bible to weep, and the first and only to call Christ, to call God by name. In her faith in spite of terrible odds, her perseverance in the face of oppression, and her love for her child, women of color have seen their own stories mirrored. So we have this great mother of faith who we rarely speak about. And we have another mother of faith who was treated terribly by her husband, dealt with this deep and caustic pain of infertility, and then abused her slave before attempting double homicide. And while all of this was perfectly legal at the time, if we're human beings with hearts and consciences, it should make us uncomfortable at the very least. And while we don't, as Christians or as Americans, often hold up the ability to live with discomfort as a civic or a spiritual virtue, I truly believe it is one of the most precious tools in our spiritual tool chest. Now, any of you who have cared for a person who's grieving knows that to be a good friend, a good family member, you have to be able to sit with tears, to sit with those questions that don't have answers. That discomfort of being in the presence of raw emotion. We've all found that to get through a pandemic, to care for our neighbors, we have to deal with the discomforts of isolation, of restricted movement, of availability, and those really unfortunate home haircuts. Since the protests in response to George Floyd's killing have swept across our nation, I've been struck by the number of times that people talk about peaceful protests. Now, clearly, some of what they mean is that those organizing the protests are not intending for them to turn violent. That's not the goal of the protest. But sometimes I wonder if what people mean when they say peaceful protest is a protest that doesn't make me uncomfortable. For all that we love to quote Martin Luther King, we have to remember that he said that in his view, the biggest barrier to civil rights wasn't the KKK or Jim Crow, but rather moderate white people who are more committed to order than to justice. Now, clearly, we have all seen these beautiful, hopeful moments in these protests. But I wonder what happens when the signs are put down and the hashtags stop trending, when it becomes a question not just of displaying a banner of justice, but actually living a life of justice? What happens when the question is not whether will I march today, but how will I choose to fund our schools, or what's taught in those schools? What if it's a question of where I choose to live and who I send my kids to camp with, who I vote for, having an uncomfortable conversation with someone I love? What if, in all of this justice talk, I see parts of myself that I'd really rather not? So I went to a mostly white college in the South, and I was a fish out of water for many, many reasons. So I was very excited freshman year when I got invited to spend the weekend with a bunch of girls at somebody's beach house. And I was so excited that I ran and told another girl in my hall named Joy that we were all going to the beach. And she looked at me a little confused, and she said, "Oh, I hadn't heard." And I said, "Oh my gosh, don't worry about it. We're all going. I'm sure you're invited." So soon after, the girl who had invited me pulled me aside and she said, "Hey, you actually can't invite Joy. My parents would kill me if I had a black person at the beach house. I mean, we have some really expensive stuff there." So I wish I could tell you that I told that girl who had invited me that this was the most ridiculous thing and that I certainly wouldn't go after that. But I didn't. I went to the beach and I left Joy alone on our hall. And it's been almost 20 years and I am still so deeply ashamed. I told that story recently to a group of black students who I graduated college with, and I think in my heart of hearts, to be really painfully honest, what I was hoping for in that confession was to say something like, "Oh my gosh, you were a kid. We were all kids. We all make mistakes. You were actually one of the better ones." But what I got was actually something like, "Hey, those experiences hurt us a lot more than it hurt you, even than it hurts you to feel guilty about it." The good news is that for Christians, acknowledging sin isn't the end of our story. We have this tool, this wonderful tool called confession, which allows us to turn all of those places of brokenness in our lives to God and to be given permission to live differently. It's why I look at that story with this gut-wrenching, profound shame. But I also know that forgiveness gives me and gives all of us this chance to start new. Our past doesn't have to be our future. But if we spend all of our energy and our time defending ourselves and coming up with excuses and attributing all of our successes to our own ingenuity, our own favor, and our failures, however grievous, to the faults of others, then we're really not living into the spirit of life that God has called us to, one that we see ourselves as we truly are, both beloved and very broken. In the 19th century, tuberculosis, TB, became a significant disease that affected Western Europe and North America. And because it started to really become common around the time that industrialization was happening, it got this reputation as being a condition connected with progress and civilization. And the fascinating thing, which is that this disease, which is very unpleasant and typically fatal, came to be seen by the upper classes of the day as a mark of culture and refinement. Why was this? So TB had this consuming effect on the body. It's why people called it consumption. And it made the women who contracted it look ethereal and doll-like with these huge eyes and tiny itty-bitty waists. If, like me, you grew up loving Anne of Green Gables, where everybody has these giant puffy sleeves and these big skirts, those fashions came about because they were meant to imitate the body type of somebody with tuberculosis. And even women who didn't have the disease wore this very pale makeup and bright red lips and blush to make them look like they had fevers. For men with TB, they were thought to be smarter, more romantic, and possessed of a genius that only somebody who was afflicted with it could attain. There's a story about the novelist Victor Hugo where somebody moaned the fact that Hugo had never had TB because if he had, imagine the heights that his genius would have reached. Now, obviously, TB is a terrible disease. It maims and kills nearly everyone who gets it in pretty gruesome ways, which I imagine some of you are Googling as I am preaching. But it's amazing that despite knowing, everybody knew that this killed you, but people still idolized it. And, we look at this like 100 years later and think, oh my gosh, that's insane. That's totally ridiculous. But it speaks to the fact that humans are always guilty of these same things. We idolize things that hurt us. Now, I think everybody would agree that there are some bad cops out there. There are people who abuse their position. The video of George Floyd's murder and the police just standing by and not intervening, or that elderly man being knocked down in Buffalo, paints this in tragic and horrifying ways. But where we may disagree is whether this is a problem of just a few bad apples or a system that's broken at its very core. When I was working in a psychiatric hospital before I became a pastor here, there was a time where we began accepting patients who were released from the prison system, but who were too sick to go back into the community. And when the hospital administration said, hey, we're going to do this, the staff were really upset, and they were very nervous about their own safety. They were nervous about the safety of the other patients. They said, we're not set up to accept sort of hardened criminals. But I will never forget our very first admission. He was this really tall, really big, burly black man in his late 40s who had spent the last 23 years in prison for doing something. He had tried to steal a backpack that God's voice had told him had $1 million in it just for him. He was a kid. He was a kid from a poor family. He was a kid having his first psychotic break. And instead of doctors and medicine and treatment, the care that we would lay down in front of train tracks for our own children, he got thrown into a cell for decades. He was one more black criminal to lock up. Law and order, not God's law and not God's order, but the human laws of whatever time and place we live in. That is the law and order that I encountered when another day I called the cops to report an assault on a black woman. And the police, without interviewing her, without asking me more than 2 or 3 questions, told me that she's making it up and they weren't going to come out and talk to either one of us. Law and order is what I might fear when I might fear for my son's safety, because when at 16, I imagine he will be speeding or running red lights. But I don't fear because I think he'll be crushed into the ground or shot in the back by the people who are supposed to protect him. Now, we all know there are great cops out there. There are really good cops and good judges. There are good white people all over the place, and there are well-meaning individuals of every stripe. I know there are because we are those people. But I also know that a system of justice that doesn't work for some of us, whether we're black or brown or immigrants or gay or trans or women or disabled or whomever, that system doesn't work for any of us. This is not the justice of the Bible, the justice that we cry out for when we invoke the name of Christ. The systems that we have are killing people, and the ones that it doesn't kill, it drives into a rage and despair that erupts into violence and riots and destruction. And instead of looking at this pain and saying, my God, what have we done to create this? All too often we stand watching with our fingers wagging, saying, yes, but. And we preach ourselves a broken gospel of human law and human order. We cry peace, peace, when there is no peace. Perhaps a more insidious idol one, though, is one that I find that I am constantly battling in myself. And that's a sense of ownership over the experiences of others. In the wake of Mr. Floyd's murder, there have been countless groups started by well-meaning white people who are trying to be good allies. And many of us are very new to this work of anti-racism. And many of us, because of our upbringings and our opportunities, are sort of used to being in charge. We have this idea in our heads, whether it's conscious or not, that what racism's really been needing is a few fired up white people to get everybody organized. Never mind that people of color have been doing this work for centuries, have written books, have taught classes, have organized and have governed. We're hardly doing this from scratch. I see this idol rise with the cheerful rallying cries for peaceful protests from white people and that just like subtle sense of control. Trust us. We'll teach you how to dissent in the right way. Now, perhaps, I hope that all of this well-meaning do-goodism is the start of something truly inspired. The first stumbling steps toward a new way of living, where we seek the guidance of Black and brown people, where we fight for the health and well-being of their children as hard as we do for our own, where we don't expect them to earn basic human rights like protection from law enforcement or access to education that many of us enjoy simply for being born. And we don't accept anything less than a society rebuilt to more accurately reflect the promises that it was built on. I hope it's that. Or this moment and this movement could be yet another idol. Look at me, someone who is so virtuous, someone who gets it. A Black woman I know whose work frequently takes her into white churches says that she judges those churches not by the reception she gets in worship or at coffee hour, but by how those members treat her when she runs into them on the street. The same people who were so warm and eager to see her in church hold their bags a little closer when they watch her walk down Gay Street. They look at her with a little bit of suspicion. And so I wonder, when the marches end, will we still walk together? It's ironic to me that Sarah, who's this woman who's so extraordinarily blessed by God, this mother of our faith, this survivor of sorrow and betrayal, was also one of the first mothers of idolatry. She received this gift, this miraculous gift of becoming a parent in her old age and having a son who was promised to be God's covenant bearer. But even with all of that, she was not content. She needed to make sure, through her own hand, that Isaac was unique and that no one else would pretend to get what he had. Paradoxically, this mother of faith didn't in the end trust God and trust that there would be enough. And so in her lack of trust, she hurt people. She was willing to sacrifice a child, a mother, in the most heartbreaking of ways. She shut up her ears to the boy named Ishmael. God hears. And in her idolatry, she was capable of terror. But I wonder, even with all of this, maybe Sarah is, at the end of the day, the perfect mother for us. Not because we want to live like her and emulate everything she did, but because she so beautifully captures who we are. We are a people of faith who are extravagantly blessed by God. And we are at the same time capable of hurting the very people that we could be closest to, the very people that God hears. In guarding her own child so fiercely, she missed the wideness of God's blessing. She saw only this very narrow part of the picture. But the good news is that if God could use Sarah, then God can use us too. At the end of her long life, after leading 70 enslaved people to freedom and serving as the first female commander of an armed army expedition, Harriet Tubman died surrounded by her family. And it said that her final words were, "I go to prepare a place for you." And all these many years later, I imagine Sarah and Hagar saying the same. There is good news in that these mothers, in all of their blessedness and their brokenness, prepared a place for us. They prepared a place when they cried out to God in pain, when they were faithful despite all odds, when they wept for their children, and they held out hope in hopeless situations. Even in her flaws, Sarah can be a model for us. In these ancient stories, I imagine her whispering to us from across the centuries, saying, "My children, children of struggle, our story is still being written. It didn't end in the desert, but it continues among you. How do you want it to finish?" In the name of the one who creates, redeems, and sustains us. Amen.